Hey Echoholics, Jimmy here, coming to you today with a new concept for short case presentations that we'd like to get out more regularly, and these we'd like to call the eye openers. So in case you need a little something extra to get you going in the morning, maybe you're feeling rough and you just need an echo to wake up a little, these will hopefully meet that need. So this first eye opener is a case of mine. I had a guy who was in his late 50s come into the emergency department. We had report by EMS before coming in that they'd found a guy down 2 days or 3 days post knee replacement with hypoxia as well as hypotension. Both in the 70s, not a good combination. And he had a history of heart failure, so it was tough to know exactly what was going on. But, of course, a guy a couple days out from a knee replacement who's hypoxic and hypotensive, the first three things on our differential are PE, and pulmonary embolism. So, he rolls into the bay, and we have a look at him. He's actually talking. He's on a non-rebreather, satting 100%. Our first blood pressures were in the 80s systolic, and then we started taking a look at his heart as we chatted about how he was feeling. So this is our first image. We can see here that the right ventricle in this parasternal long axis view looks to be a bit dilated. If we think about our rule of threes, the RV, the LV outflow tract, as well as the left atrium, all being lined up and should be relatively the same size, but we're seeing here that one of those things, the RV, looks quite big. We also notice the LV might look a little underfilled with some possible paradoxical septal motion there along the septum, but we'll get a little better look at that when we move into the short axis. So we rotate that probe 90 degrees clockwise and see the short axis view of that left ventricle, and notice, yeah, indeed, that septum really seems to bow into the left ventricle and flatten out, making that D-shaped septum during diastole. Really here, it kind of rounds out during systole. So that tells us that the pressures in that right ventricle during diastole seem to be higher than the pressures in the left ventricle. Now what's causing that, we don't know yet. So we move down to the apex, and this isn't a great view. We weren't able to roll him quite yet, but getting a quick look, we notice that the right ventricle seems to be roughly the same size probably as the left ventricle in this imperfect apical view. And then if we move the probe a little bit more towards the midline, we're able to get a nice view of that right ventricle and kind of isolate it. And then we notice that along the tricuspid annulus, we really don't see much motion back and forth with contraction and relaxation. That's a measurement we call TAPSE, or tricuspid annular plane systolic excursion, which is a mouthful and a complicated term for an easy concept. It just means how much does that tricuspid annulus get pulled up towards the apex during systole, and then of course relax down that same amount during diastole. That, if it's a large number, greater than 1.6 centimeters, that tells us that RV myocardium is squeezing well and pulling that tricuspid annulus up towards the apex. If it's not squeezing well, then we won't see much distance traveled by that tricuspid annulus. And so a number less than 1.6 centimeters for TAPSE indicates an impaired systolic function of the right ventricle. And so if we put an M mode through that tricuspid annulus, we get something that looks like this and allows us to measure the back and forth motion of that annulus over time. And in this case, indeed, we had a TAPSE of less than a centimeter. Also, if we put continuous wave through that, continuous wave Doppler through that tricuspid valve, we were able to pick up a regurg jet. And that regurg jet, if we measure the peak velocity, the machine will turn that peak velocity into a pressure gradient. And that pressure gradient simply tells us what's the difference in pressure between the right ventricle and the right atrium during systole. And so that gives us an idea of what the pulmonary artery systolic pressures are going to be. As long as we add whatever baseline right atrial or central venous pressure that we think there is, then we can add that to the pressure gradient from the tricuspid regurg and get a rough estimate of what the pulmonary artery systolic pressure is. So in this guy, it was a little surprising. I was expecting, with a dilated right ventricle, it doesn't appear to be squeezing well. I was expecting the pressures to be pretty high, but in this case, a pressure of about 18 millimeters of mercury. Even if we add a relatively high central venous pressure of 15 millimeters of mercury, still gets us barely into mild pulmonary hypertension range. So that was a little bit surprising. And then we take a look at the IVC, and if we look for the collapsibility of the IVC to see whether it's greater or less than 50%, this appears to be a little less than 50% collapsibility with inspiratory effort. And the IVC appears dilated more than 2 centimeters, so we'd give that a high value of 15 millimeters of mercury estimated for the central venous pressure. So maybe just a mild pulmonary hypertension in this guy, but kind of barely making it there. Not exactly what we'd expect in somebody with a massive pulmonary embolism. And so I go searching for this pulmonary artery, looking for a clot. And here is a view of the pulmonary artery branching into the right and left branches of the pulmonary artery. And I don't see any evidence there of clot or saddle embolism. The pulmonary trunk certainly appears dilated. And so I was a little disappointed I couldn't find a clot, but while I was there, I measured a pulmonary artery acceleration time. That's simply putting pulsed wave in the pulmonary artery just beyond that pulmonic valve and measuring the time that it takes for that pulmonary acceleration waveform to go from baseline to its peak acceleration or peak velocity. And so in this case, it was 95 milliseconds, which is short compared to normal. But what I was looking to do is see if this guy met the 60-60 rule. You see, he had a contrast allergy, and so we couldn't get him to CT for a CT angio in order to diagnose this pulmonary embolism. So I was really looking for any evidence to support either anticoagulating or giving this guy thrombolytics if his hypotension should remain the same or get worse. And so the 60-60 rule simply states that if your pulmonary artery acceleration time is less than 60 milliseconds, as well as your tricuspid regurgitation pressure gradient is less than 60 millimeters of mercury, then that is an acute elevation of pulmonary pressures consistent with and very specific for a pulmonary embolism. So this guy would have met the 60-60 rule with his tricuspid regurgitation pressure gradient, because that was less than 60, but he did not meet the criteria of a pulmonary artery acceleration time being less than 60 milliseconds. So I couldn't hang my hat on the 60-60 sign either, but again, strongly suspicious with a guy who's a few days out from a knee replacement having a pulmonary embolism to be the cause of his hypotension and hypoxia. So what happened with this case? What was the clinical course? Well, the major ways echo helped us manage this is that we were able to see that the right heart was failing, and so we held any additional fluids. Often in a hypotensive person, you would probably flog them with some saltwater drowning in order to try and get that blood pressure up. However, in someone with a failing right ventricle, that extra volume to the right ventricle is only going to increase the pressure in the right ventricle to an extent that it becomes ischemic and is unable to push blood forward, even worse. And so in this case, additional fluids would have really impaired this guy's right ventricle and perhaps caused more ischemia as well as more hypotension to that right ventricle. He was low risk for any bleeding complications, so we went ahead and started heparin, knowing that it was going to be a while before we definitively diagnosed whether this guy had a pulmonary embolism or not. But our suspicion was high enough that the risks, the benefits seemed to outweigh the risks when it came to starting the guy on heparin, which you can, of course, reverse if needed. Now, we did get a lower extremity duplex of that right leg looking for blood clot and did not find any evidence of blood clot or DVT, but we kept him on heparin nonetheless. We just had the one leg scanned. And then eventually, while on the heparin, blood pressures came up to a reasonable enough range that we felt he was stable to go down for a VQ scan. It came back as moderate probability for pulmonary embolism in the left upper lobe. And so he goes off to the MICU, and the MICU is able to appropriately pre-treat him for any sort of anaphylactic reaction to IV contrast, and was able to get a CT scan the next day that indeed confirmed pulmonary embolism. And so just to recap some of the salient points in this, the 60-60 sign involves a tricuspid regurg pressure gradient of less than 60 millimeters of mercury. And if that's combined with a pulmonary artery acceleration time that's less than 60 milliseconds, then that is highly specific for pulmonary embolism. In truth, I think anything that causes an abrupt increase in pulmonary artery pressures will probably meet this rule, such as abrupt ARDS. But in any case, the literature we have says this is very specific for pulmonary embolism, or at least a very acute increase in pulmonary artery pressures. And so what was going on with this guy? Why didn't he meet the 60-60 rule? Well, it's not a very sensitive sign, for one, and one of the reasons he may not have met it is because his pressures were so low in that right ventricle, probably because his RV had sustained significant ischemia from the pulmonary embolism already and was unable to generate any significant pressures. His troponin, his first troponin that we got came back at 8 or 9, and so evidence of significant ischemia to that right ventricle, and that's probably why he wasn't able to pump adequately or generate any significant pressures by the time we saw him. TAPSE is a measure of RV systolic function, and if it's less than 1.6 centimeters, that is an impaired RV systolic function, and just be cautious with fluids in those people, especially if the IVC already appears dilated and is not collapsing. All right, that is it for the first eye opener. This is Echoholics Anonymous, and thank you for tuning in. We have a lot more content coming your way. Please stay with us.